Hello and welcome to New Game Plus. My name is Jamie, and although we've done hundreds of episodes over the last 10 years, this is the first one that I've actually hosted. So I'm going to take this moment right now to apologize in advance, and if you have any issues with the episode you're about to witness, please be sure to @McDermott on Twitter with your feedback. I'm sure he'd love it, but please don't actually do that. We've got a great show for your viewing pleasure, as I want to take you on a trip through the past, the present, and the future. Now, what that is, I'll leave it up to you to discover as we dive into our first segment, right now. So recently, I moved house and did a major upgrade on my setup to better take advantage of the new consoles. I've got an awesome TV and an amazing sound system to match, so seeing and hearing the benefits of things like 4K, HDR, VRR, and Dolby Atmos is amazing. Yet I'm finding more and more enjoyment these days diving into gaming's extensive past and just seeing how we got to this point. It's something I've been thinking about a bit lately thanks to, of all things, Beavis and Butthead. So the other day I was futzing around with ScumVM. It's a great bit of software that takes old PC point-and-click adventure games and makes them playable on not just modern computers, but a variety of devices. You can play incredibly well-known games like, say, The Secret of Monkey Island, or Ending of the King's Quest, or even Grim Fandango, and some real obscurities. That's where I discovered that there was, of all things, a Beavis and Butthead adventure game, and despite everything you'd been led to believe at the time, it's actually good? That to me is the wonder of retro gaming. The sensation of discovering something you didn't know ever existed and being pleasantly surprised that it's actually better than you think it is. It's fascinating to me to see concepts originate and watching them evolve over the years, and depending on what kind of games you're into, there's a lot on offer. So for instance, I'm really interested in PlayStation-era racing games. Not just because there's a bunch of really good racing games on the system, but also because the console released right as the industry transitioned from making 2D games to 3D games, which meant that every developer had to more or less adapt or perish to the sea change. On top of that, there's a definite shift from the first racing games released onto the console to the ones released later in the PS1. Mostly it's due to developers getting used to the console and its various eccentricities, but as more and more design decisions got codified and established as part of the genre, people also started experimenting as to what a racing game could be. The best way I can explain this is to take a look at a racing game that you might not have heard of, but I think does a lot of really cool and interesting things, especially for the time. So in 1999, there's a company called Squaresoft who were firing on all cylinders, exploring more genres than just the RPGs that are still their bread and butter. For some context, this is the year they released Final Fantasy VIII, Front Mission 3, Chrono Cross, Parasite Eve 2, and Legend of Mana, just to name a few. Yet there was one title that quietly made its presence known amongst Japanese gamers, was a game that was simply called Racing Lagoon. Now, at its core, Racing Lagoon takes the RPG and storytelling that Squaresoft were known for and matches it up with a racing game. Granted, it's not a particularly great racing game, but it's pretty novel in its own right thanks to some design choices lifted from the RPGs that were a dime a dozen on the console. So basically, you have an overworld where you drive around progressing the story. Every so often, you get into a random encounter where you need to race against another driver. If you win, you get the chance to steal one of the opposing driver's car parts, allowing you to customize your ride. However, the interesting little wrinkle is that if you lose, opponents have a chance to steal one of your parts. It's a great bit of risk-reward that really pushes you to keep upgrading your car and stay competitive, lest you be left in the dust. Where the game ultimately wins you over is the vibe. The game takes a ton of inspiration from Initial D, and not just because it's a story about underground street races and your starting car is a legally distinct Sprinter Treno amongst all the other legally distinct 80s and 90s JDM cars. But what if it was taken even more seriously than Initial D, and has a tad more pretentiousness? Now that's Square in a nutshell around this time, and it's glorious. Now, what I mean to say here is that the story is utterly ridiculous, their character designs are ludicrous, and the dialogue is overly poetic and flowery. Now, the thing is though, none of this is a slight. Not in the slightest. When all of that comes together, it creates a truly unique experience that no other racing game has even come close to attempting. We've had racing games with dialogue and character and story well after this, but it's nothing compared to what Racing Lagoon even attempts. It's a perfect encapsulation of the late 90s, and it's glorious for it. Sadly, Racing Lagoon didn't perform particularly well in its native Japan, and despite Square taking all sorts of risks in localizing their games, it was one of 2 games they released in 1999 that never got localized, cementing it as a cult classic for years to come. It wasn't until November of last year where a brave soul known as Hilltop led a team to finally do a fan translation, and it's absolutely fabulous. That's how I finally came across it after hearing about this game for the longest time, and it was worth it. Now, sure, Racing Lagoon doesn't really hold up if you were to compare it to the racing games we have today, but I think in a lot of ways, it does some stuff that most contemporary racing games wouldn't try do. Mostly because it tries to avoid any and all forms of simulation and car and track licensing that nearly every contemporary racing game is obligated to do. It's allowed to be weird and go do its own thing. For as good as we have with games like, say, Gran Turismo 7 or Assetto Corsa providing challenging racing, or Forza Horizon 5 providing the best Hoon sim out there, or even Codemasters trying to integrate racing with plot in F1 2021 and Grid Legends, there's a charm to what Square did with a fraction of its cost and the technology available. And I think it's worth remembering. So, I implore you, go seek out the history of a genre you like and see where your favorite games came from. It's fascinating stuff, and you might just discover a new favorite by going backwards. Or if anything else, it's a fine way to spend a lazy afternoon or to get away from the games you're currently playing. Retro gaming has been a part of New Game Plus since the very beginning, whether it was the weird and retro lads showing off their old oddities, or the old Game Plus folk discussing older games a bit more broadly. For the last few years, I've been making a series of videos on YouTube known as The Recommended, which are essays dedicated to cool old games that I think you really should go check out. So I'm going to leave you with one of the more recent videos I've done, which covered Capcom's cult classic fighter Rival Schools. I'm pretty proud of the way this one turned out, and I hope you dig it as much as I dug making it. What's the first thing you think of when you see and hear this? For a lot of people, it'll be something iconic and genre-defining like Resident Evil or Street Fighter. For others, it'll be something a bit more recent like Monster Hunter or Phoenix Wright. If you love your action games, there's the things like Onimusha or Devil May Cry. For the slightly older crowd, there's the many different iterations of Mega Man. Capcom are known for a lot of iconic and fascinating properties, but they're also home to many cult hits, such as Rival Schools, United by Fate. Rival Schools was one of Capcom's earliest attempts at a 3D, fully polygonal fighting game at a time where the industry was starting to transition from 2D backgrounds and sprite work, yet also during a time where 2D fighting games were at their most expressive and beautiful. To put this into some context, Rival Schools was originally released in 1997, the same year that Capcom released the last Darkstalkers game, Vampire Savior, and the first 2 versions of Street Fighter III, all of which ported 2D hardware in some amazing ways. On a basic level, Rival Schools doesn't try to push 3D in ways that feel like a gimmick. You can move in and out of the background, but that's just about it. It does take advantage of the space to allow you to pop opponents into the air, juggle them, sort of like the Versus Series aerial rave mechanic. It also shares some DNA with Street Fighter, featuring a countering system that's similar to the recently introduced Alpha counter system, but it stands out on its own thanks to 2 key factors. The first is the game's emphasis on teamwork. Much like with the Versus games, you select 2 characters to battle it out, but unlike in those games, you can't take out during fights, you play rounds with 1 character at a time. Think of it like SNK's King of Fighters series, but only just kind of. Instead, the second character acts more like an assist, and depending on the character, actually can do more than just a team-up attack. Some characters offer healing abilities, while others can offer you more charges on your super meter. Hell, even one in particular can even do damage to you if you're feeling frisky. The neat thing about this is, if you ever feel like switching it up, you absolutely can. At the end of every round, you have the option to switch characters and see how both characters work as a primary and secondary. It's a good way to encourage you to try out the cast and see what team combinations work best. The other factor is that Rival Schools, for a fighting game in the late 90s, actually has a plot. It's something that's actually featuring as an element of the game, as opposed to being just a throwaway thing to justify the theme. Every fight in the arcade game has a brief story interlude between fights, and even if the story itself isn't the greatest, it's far more of an effort than most games of its era. And justifying that story is actually a pretty exciting cast. Sure, they're more or less a collection of archetypes and tropes, but they're all super exciting and fun to play as. You've got your shonen hot-blooded protagonist, your cool-headed school council member, foreign exchange students, biker gangs, overly excited PE teachers, and even a certain schoolgirl that made her debut only a year prior. On top of that, the game does wonders with its personality, especially when the team-up attacks are as fun and vibrant as they are here. And yet, that isn't what makes Rival Schools truly memorable. Where the game really stands out is its amazing and weird PlayStation port. Compared to other fighting games at the time, Rival Schools' port stands out as being more than what you'd expect, not just because of how it attempted to convert an arcade game to the PlayStation, but how it attempted to expand upon the original release in one of the most unique and interesting ways possible. Because you see, Rival Schools doesn't come on just one disc. It comes on two. Two discs for a fighting game. The first disc, the arcade disc, is fairly straightforward. It's more or less a complete port of the arcade game, retaining all the story cutscenes between fights, even adding voiceover during your segments. Unlike in the arcade version, you can freely choose your characters if you don't wish to engage the plot, and you've got a few hidden characters to play as. The second disc, known as the Evolution disc, is a bit more interesting. It too has a version of the arcade game, just about all the story cutscenes, but it makes up for it with a lot more in terms of mode and content. To put this into perspective, most fighting game ports at the time would never really have much more than a versus and training mode. If you're lucky, you would have like a league or a tournament mode. Hell, even most Capcom ports didn't go as hard as Rival Schools did at the time. Clearing the game with multiple characters and difficulties unlocks extra mini-games and modes that are a fun distraction and a good alternative to the fighting action. Aside from the aforementioned league and tournament modes, which are pretty cool, there's even a full-blown tutorial mode that actually goes through the game mechanics, which was almost unheard of in the late 90s. Yet even that's not the craziest thing this game has. The Japanese version of the game includes what effectively amounts to a school simulation mode, not a school life. It's more or less kind of a visual novel, kind of a dating sim, that kind of thing. You play as a customized character, join one of the 5 schools in the game's world, and take part in school activities over the course of a year, developing relationships with the other members of the cast. Once you've completed it, you can take that customized character into the game proper and battle it out. It was so successful that Capcom even released an updated version of the game that not only included more characters, but expanded on this school life mode. There was a rumor that Capcom were going to bring this mode over to the Western version of the game, but didn't due to the requirements of the translation at the time. The only hint of it ever existing in the Western version are the 24 bonus characters you can unlock, which are more or less the custom characters you can play as in that game. All this is important because up to this point, Capcom had a reputation for some less than stellar fighting game ports to the PlayStation. It's especially painful as this was at a time where they were at their creative peak when it came to the genre. If it wasn't understandable things like animation frames or sound clips being cut due to technical limitations, it was removing fundamental mechanics and changing the core of the game. So as an example, the legendary Marvel tag team fighters of the time famously dropped the tag mechanic for their PlayStation 1 ports, leaving the second character as a glorified assist that you couldn't select. It totally changed the feel and vibe of the game, and these versions are by far the ways you do not want to experience them. What helped is the arcade version of Rival Schools was designed for hardware that's more or less similar to the original PlayStation. Sort of like how Namco had an arcade port that was kind of the same thing, which basically resulted in arcade ports that didn't feel as compromised and actually really close to the original game. Granted, the PS1 port doesn't look quite as nice or have all the sound, and there is more loading, but playing it on PlayStation, well, Rival Schools is weirdly enough pretty close to its arcade counterpart, and that's kinda something. Sadly, Rival Schools doesn't really leave that much of a legacy. Arguably the biggest thing about the game was it was only the second game to be directed by a guy called Hideaki Itsuno, a man who would go on to not only direct some great fighting games, but also redefine the action genre and take it in some fantastic directions, but also in some divisive ones. Over the years, Itsuno said he wants to make a new entry in the series, but given his interest in how long it takes the man to make anything these days, not exactly holding my breath here. Rival Schools did spawn a sequel, however, known as Project Justice in this part of the world. It was an arcade and Dreamcast game which continued the story and introduced some cool new characters. Mechanically, the fights are now 3-on-3, which means you now have a second assist and another character to switch between during rounds. You also have the ability to interrupt team-up attacks in a quick minigame, which adds to the tension and excitement of each fight. Unfortunately, that's the last time we'd see any of the Rival Schools cast or plot in their own game. In the years since, a handful of characters in the series have more or less been relegated to either appearances in crossover games, or show up as cameos or references in others. Neither Rival Schools or Project Justice have been re-released digitally in any form, save for a Japanese PlayStation Store release of the original game. But maybe the future of the series is a little brighter. Capcom recently announced that Akira from the series is joining Street Fighter V in 2021, making her the first character who debuted in that series to join the prestigious fighting game franchise. At the end of it all, Rival Schools is the perfect game to be called a cult hit. It's got some great mechanics, a cool cast of characters, and enough personality that it's lasted through the years as part of the Capcom fighting game universe. It's left its mark in more ways than one, and if anything else, gave us a fantastic home port that felt way ahead of its time. With Capcom still going through something of a renaissance, I doubt we'd ever get anything new from the franchise in this day and age, but of all the fighting games and franchises to pull something from, Rival Schools is definitely one of the cooler ones that more people should be aware of. So I don't know when I became the car guy for New Game Plus, or at least the guy who reviews a lot of car games, but I think it started way back in 2012 when I reviewed the first Forza Horizon, a game that I actually still really like. I revisited a few months ago, and it holds up pretty well. Wish you could buy it again, but licensing is great. So what I wanted to do was take you back 10 years ago where I had a little bit more hair, I actually had a little bit less weight, and to show you like, hey, this is what I looked like 10 years ago as me reviewing a video game. That's great. Video games are cool, I guess. So here we go, Forza Horizon from 2012, go. So now that we're coming up to the end of the generation, what we're seeing is not quite full sequels anymore, but more kind of interquels or midquels or not quite full sequels, however you want to call it. If you want examples, you got things like Gears of War Judgment or even God of War Ascension. But then you also have Forza Horizon, which is not really Forza Motorsport 5, but it might as well should be because it's probably the best Forza game to date, and that's saying quite a lot. So the idea behind Horizon is it's an open world racing game. You're given an open world to drive around in, and it's actually legitimately probably the best thing that has ever happened to the series. Mostly because the open world actually makes a lot of sense. Like there are collectibles in the game which are really smartly designed and make sense. There's a kudo system much similar to Project Gotham Racing, which means that if you're like me, you just set a waypoint to the other side of the world and just go for your life, just go see how much kudos you can rack up, because it is still really fun to drive around in those cars. I mean, hell, it is a Forza game. I mean, if anything else, the cars are still great to drive. That being said, there are some concessions made to kind of not feel like as kind of cold or restrictive as Forza has been in the past. Like, for instance, handling is kind of a lot more looser. But it retains probably the best part of Forza, for me anyway, which is customization. Like the customizable difficulties from Forza 4 are back, you've got the vinyl storefront and the vinyl customization from that game. Not to mention you also have the insane tuning setups which you can do, as well as the easy tune if you prefer to go that route. It's really a smart way to kind of bring in Forza without kind of alienating too many people. That being said though, there are a couple of issues which bug me. First off, you've got the fact that, and admittedly this is more of a problem I think with Forza, is that it's only got two types of races in the game world. You got lap-based racing or point-to-point racing, which isn't bad, it's limiting considering you have an open world and the multiplayer has a lot more fun modes which would have made sense in the offline game. That also being said, the game also kind of comes across as a DLC trap with the game constantly telling you, hey, there are microtransactions, there are things you can buy, there are consumables, and not to mention there's a season pass in the game which costs as much as the game itself. It's pretty insane. But with all that being said though, I mean, it is still a really fun racing game, and honestly the most fun I've had with a Forza title to date. So if you're like me and you really want to try an open world racing game that's not quite as manic or insane as Need for Speed or Most Wanted, Horizon is definitely your best bet. Let me make clear up front that conclusions are not my strongest suit. I've never been particularly great at ending things, partly because I want the good times to last and it delays me ever thinking about what happens when it's all over. However, all things must pass, and even New Game Plus got to that point. Now, that's not to say I never pondered the idea of just what the end of New Game Plus would be like. Over the years, I'd occasionally take a moment to think about how I'd go out. There were a lot of ways, but one I always thought of was to give nothing but blistering takes and going out like I had nothing to lose, because what's a bridge if it's not allowed to be set on fire? I'd imagine it'd be something where I tell the world things like, say, Max Payne 3 is a bad video game that only awful people like, or Serious Business was a segment I always thought was shit. Now, none of those are true, by the way, but going out like an edgelord isn't really who I am or something I'm partial to, but the power to do that without consequence is intoxicating, I can assure you. Basically, I never really thought to be sincere or genuine about providing a conclusion, let alone even give one, because every time I've been asked to provide a coda on this here show, I've never been particularly happy with them or the circumstances surrounding them. You may have seen the last two times I've done this, when we said farewell to Channel 31 due to the impending government shutdowns, only for the shutdowns to be delayed at the last minute. Those experiences really soured me on the whole idea of saying farewell, enough to the point where I actually strongly considered just not even doing this episode and just letting someone else take my spot. Now, I know, different circumstances and all, but after two farewells, I didn't have it in me to do a third and not have it stick. You do not know frustration until you've been told that there is no future by a government that does not care and having to prep for an end, and then quite literally at the 11th hour being told this isn't the case. And that happened twice. At that point, why bother saying goodbye again? I won't lie, doing this show for so long has been tough, and there were a couple of points throughout the decade where I was pretty much just ready to flat out quit. No farewell, no big thing, just screw it, I'm out of here. I don't know what would have happened if I followed through on this decision, but knowing what I know now, I probably would have regretted leaving. They may not have been always the easiest times or the most successful times, but they've been the most rewarding times creatively and passionately, and I think that's okay. But I always kind of wondered the all-important what if. What if I'd actually left those times? What would my life have been like? Where would I have ended up? You know. I've been pondering that the question every so often over the last decade, and truthfully, I could never really think of a solid answer. The only thing I was certain of is if I did leave either of those times, I probably wouldn't have gotten some awesome opportunities. I probably wouldn't have the confidence to cold email former Yakuza translator Scott Strickard and somehow convince him and Sega Europe PR that him being on a Yakuza panel at PAX Australia was a good idea. I probably wouldn't have really gotten into video editing or even live streaming or sunk the time into learning how to do it. I wouldn't have gotten good at organization and trying to keep the show on track behind the scenes. Most importantly, I wouldn't have met some incredibly cool and talented people that I am extremely proud to call my friends. Now, I'm not one for advice, but there's one thing I want you to take away from all of this. Cherish the people around you, because the people you meet are the reason for doing anything. The people that make this television show or have contributed to it in some way over the last decade gave me all the reasons in the world to stick around because they made working on this project fun and a truly unique, fulfilling, and an enjoyable hobby. We may have disagreed, we may have not always seen eye to eye, but I wouldn't have it any other way. I also wouldn't be here without you, the viewer. Whether it's genuinely giving us your time, not understanding that our show's name is New Game Plus, or people who wanted to hang out on our Discord and just shitpost. Knowing that there's someone out there who cares somewhat about what you're doing is a hell of a feeling. Seriously, the wildest thing that's ever happened to me during the show is one of the higher-ups at my place of employment talking to me about the show and gaming ever so often because he somehow stumbled across me on the television. I still can't believe it. It's the wildest thing. So with all that said, I think I'm okay with this being my third farewell, and the one I really want to stick with. I've been a part of community television productions for around 15 years or so, and I've seen just how suddenly they can end and without any real closure, both as a viewer and as someone involved in production. Knowing that this is the end and actually being able to give that closure is a hell of a feeling, and one that I'm ultimately thankful for. When we started New Game Plus, I was 23 years old, still kind of shy, lacking confidence, had little experience in work and life, said plenty of stupid shit and barely left home most days. A decade on, I've seen more of the world, established a network of contacts and people to work with. I love leaving the house and going exploring, and I've ditched the shyness and now more confident in myself than I've ever been. I still say stupid shit, but at least I'm more aware of it now. So this chapter might be done, but the future of what we're doing doesn't really seem so bad. Yeet.